to the PeakDay podcast, where we discuss fertility and natural family planning with our friends. Today's guest is Emily Stimpson Chapman. Emily is an award-winning Catholic writer living in Pittsburgh with her husband and 3 young children, ages 5, 3, and 2. She's the author of several books for adults and is also the co-author of a new series of children's books with Scott Hahn. Emily has authored 6 studies for the women's ministry Endow, is the editor and co-author of the Formed in Christ high school textbook series, and is the author of numerous Bible studies, as well as articles and essays for Catholic publications. Thank you so much, Emily, for being our guest on the PeakDay podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I think we just kind of want to start off with asking you, can you share about your journey towards parenthood?
So I married a lot later in life than most Catholic moms do. Not necessarily by choice. It was just what God had for me. I always thought I would marry young, but I ended up not marrying till I just turned 41, and I had always dreamed of having a big Catholic family, but marrying at 41, we were just like, please, Lord, bless us, with a child would be wonderful. And before we married, my husband and I had talked about the possibility of infertility and adoption. And I am like type A choleric, always struggling with control issues. So before we got married, I was like visiting the NAPRO doctors and getting the blood panels done and having everything checked out. And was getting the green light, like everything looks good. You should have no problem conceiving even with your age. But that didn't happen. 1 month went by, and 2 months, and 3 months, and a year. And when you're trying to conceive later in life, every month feels like a year because, you have such a short window and it's rapidly closing. And, if you're 22, you're like, oh, we've got time. When you're 42, you're like, there's no time. There's no time. I had a couple of NAPRO surgeries, some exploratory labs, and just nothing was happening. So my husband and I decided to start pursuing adoption. And really, the second we decided to open the window to adoption, God was like, here's a baby, and here's a baby, here's a baby. So we adopted 3 babies in 2.5 years. Our youngest 2 were 8 months apart. And I am just starting to get my feet under me and my brain maybe back just a little bit after a really, really intense several years with the adoptions and so many babies really all at once. We drove west to California with our 8-month-old to adopt our youngest. I'm like, how did we do that? Like, how did we ever manage? But yeah, so now we're very busy. We adopted our first son when I was 43, and my second 2 we adopted when I was 45.
So do you have any tips for other couples that are balancing that generosity with prudence in being open to new life and adoption?
We were very happy to welcome babies quickly because, one, it took a huge toll on my heart. Like, adoption is very much a spiritual pregnancy, spiritual labor, but it didn't take a huge toll on my body other than the stress. Maybe the stress did take a huge toll on my body. But we felt like, okay, adopting the children close together was actually a gift. All of the children were very much presented to us. So it wasn't like we sought to do 3 adoptions in 2.5 years. So it was learning to trust. When we were struggling with infertility, I realized I had to trust God with my infertility. Like, trusting God with our fertility doesn't just mean trusting Him when babies come. It means trusting Him when babies aren't coming. And then with the adoptions, I had to trust God's timing in that. People now are like, are you going to have more babies? Or are there any more adoptions? Or like, you know what? We're getting a little bit older. I'm 48 now. My husband's 55. And you start doing the math and going outwards. Like, how old will we be at high school? But at the same time, we're still open to God's will. Like, just if I were 48 and got pregnant, we would welcome that life. And I've had friends who've been 48 and gotten pregnant. So I think it's just trust. It's trusting God's timing and trusting that when a baby comes, even if it's not in your plan, that it's good. Like, life is always good. At one point when we were with our first son, the situation was a tough one. And we were talking to our priest about it. And he's like, well, you never say no to a baby. And I was like, that's good guidance. You never say no to a baby. So you might say, I don't think we're ready for a baby right now, but if the baby comes, like, you welcome the baby.
So you were speaking a lot about trust, Emily. Would you say that that is one of the biggest lessons you've learned from adoption, or what would you say is the biggest lesson that you've learned from adoption?
I mean, I would say trust is the biggest lesson I've learned in life with God. So it's not just about adoption. It's about your plans for marriage, your plans for fertility, your plans for, your struggles with infertility. It's about adoption, like just trusting that he sees way more than we can see and knows more than we know. With each of our children, you can see how beautifully his plan has come together in ways that are blessing us now, that are blessing them, that are blessing their birth parents, and more people than we can imagine. Like I think about all of the people who, I get a lot of questions about adoption because I'm a public Catholic with a decent sized platform. And the number of people that I've been able to encourage to think about adoption or help them figure out what is ethical adoption, how does that work? And those are things I never could have done if we hadn't adopted. So God just uses everything in such a beautiful way. And we get very focused on what we can see right in front of us and panic because what we see is not what we were expecting or not what we think can be good. But God sees it all. And so, yeah, the trust, that continual lesson of trust that he's been weaving through my life and adoptions has just been one of the ways that I've had to work on that lesson. Obviously, it's a lesson I need to learn because he keeps bringing it up again and again and again. So I'm like, I'll control it. And he's like, no, let me do it. You need to trust. So
Just earlier, you talked about seeing a NAPRO doctor and working on your fertility in that way. Um, were you always, very aware of your fertility? How did you, what's your like fertility awareness journey, maybe?
So I spent most of my adulthood in Steubenville, surrounded by lots of Catholic families who were mostly all using NFP. So cervical mucus came up at dinner parties on a regular basis. Steubenville's a weird kind of place. So I had a good knowledge of what NFP was and how it worked. But in terms of my own body and my own fertility, I didn't really learn a lot about the specifics of it until I got closer to marriage. I'd had a number of health issues in my 30s with just various reproductive like fibroids and polyps and cysts. And after those had all come to a head is when I started learning more about my own fertility and how these things were actually signs of problems and how I should have. I thought for a long time NFP was just for married people and because natural family planning, which is why I don't like the name natural family planning. I like fertility awareness much more because I should have known more about my body. My doctor should have known more about my body. By the time I was in my late 30s, I was like, why do I understand more about my fertility than the OBs that I'm visiting when I'm not seeing a NAPRO? So for me, the familiarity with NFP was always there, but in terms of my own body and fertility awareness, it definitely didn't come around until much later than it should have.
Talking about just parenthood in general, like what would you say are your highest highs and maybe some of your lowest lows?
I will take a snuggly baby any day of the week. Snuggly babies are wonderful. I love my littlest is 2 right now and newly 2. And so she is just discovering things and her personality is exploding and everything she does is hilarious. And I love this stage of parenting where you're just getting to see who the child is. And one of the great joys of adoption is I don't have any expectations that they're going to be like me or like my husband, like each child. And that's always true with all children. Every child is a mystery. But I think sometimes if you give birth to your child, there's some expectation. The mystery is a little more of a shock. You're like, oh, It's not what I was expecting. Where with adoption, you're like, oh, it's like it's a fun box of surprises. So I love discovering who my children are. Managing the chaos is tough. Like just trying to balance like, very energetic little boys and my preference for order, and then trying to navigate the internet where everyone's always telling you that you're doing something wrong, and everything you do is wrong, and that it can be a challenge to shut out the voices and just try to focus on what I know is best for my children and what God is calling our family to in particular.
How was your husband's experience of infertility different or maybe the same from yours? And how did he feel about adoption?
So my husband is high school theology teacher. So he is, I was lucky to be married to someone who had a deep understanding of the church's teachings on life and family and what openness to life and generosity are. During the time we were struggling with infertility, his experience was definitely different. I think it hurt him to see me suffering so much and feeling like he couldn't do anything about it. So I definitely, as a woman, internalized the struggle more. I felt like I was failing. I was failing as a woman. I was failing as a wife. I was failing as a Catholic woman. And he thought that was all nonsense, but he felt like he was failing me because he couldn't make the pain go away. He couldn't break through all of the lies on repeat in my head. But in terms of adoption, he was very open to it. Like he felt like we had said yes to life and that we shouldn't be super particular about, how that life was going to come, that the call to generosity and openness to life doesn't necessarily mean biological children. Like everyone is called to be open to life, even if you're not able to conceive. So he was really happy to move into adoption, and my husband's great at saying yes. He says yes to good things, and all of our babies are very good things.
So, what sources of comfort would you suggest for a woman who's facing, the pain of expectations not being met or hopes not being fulfilled when it comes to motherhood?
I think there's two levels. There's like nature and grace, and I'll start with grace. It's important to not see motherhood as a consolation. Like spiritual motherhood is not a consolation prize. Spiritual motherhood is actually what all women are called to, and it's what physical motherhood is a sign of. Like spiritual motherhood is the real thing. Physical motherhood is the physical reality that's revealing the spiritual reality. That's how Catholics understand the world with a sacramental worldview. The physical always reveals the spiritual, the visible reveals the invisible. And so focusing on spiritual motherhood wherever you are, whether that's work, whether that's with your godchildren, with your nieces and nephews, with your neighbors, like how are you called to nurture and nourish life around you? How are you called to receive the gift of others? How are you called to see their beauty and see their struggles and really love them where they are? That's the heart of spiritual motherhood. It's the feminine genius. So not thinking you're not a mother simply because you're not bearing children, and pouring yourself out wherever God has you. It's not just a distraction. It does fulfill you. It does bring joy. On the natural level, what was best for me is really when we eased up on all of the like special diets and taking this pill and taking this hormone, because it was making me crazy. It was so much control and probably causing more stress than it was alleviating. So just not to get so caught up into thinking you have to do everything right, that if you go ahead and have your glass of wine, have that hamburger with the bun. Like it's not, your fertility is not dependent upon you doing every single thing right. Like if God wants you to have a baby, you will have a baby regardless of that glass of wine. If he, has other plans for you, all of the, fertility micromanagement in the world is not going to help you. And it actually can hurt because it starts to become, I'm doing all the things right, so why aren't you giving me a baby? It's, I do this, you're supposed to do that, God. It makes our relationship with him transactional, and it starts to make children something we think we're entitled to, that children are a right and not a gift or not a blessing. And so there really is a balance between caring for your body and healing your body and just relaxing into life and trusting that, the fate of your fertility is not ultimately up to you. It's up to God.
Besides being a parent, of course, you're a writer and a blogger and a speaker. Do you have any advice for women about developing their own gifts, whether it's writing or financial planning, even while living out their vocation of motherhood?
I think one of the things that we lose sight of is that our gifts, they're for building up the church, but God is not interested in using you to build up the church. Like, God is interested in transforming you and loving you and calling you to himself. And so if he has given you gifts to use, you always have to see them first and foremost in that context. Like, God doesn't need me to write. God doesn't, need you to be doing a podcast. Like, he could have the walls and the stones write the words and do the podcast if that's what he wanted. But he's called us to that for us, and then from there as a blessing to other people. And so looking at how is this good for me? Is this helping me to be closer to God? Is it helping me to understand myself more and understand him more? Is it helping me in my vocation as a mother? Am I able to love my children more and serve them better because of it? And so just not ever separating out that, well, I have to do this for these reasons, but to really see it in the holistic growth of holiness and Christian maturity. And everybody's call is so unique. Like, God speaks to each family differently. He speaks to each person differently. We always try to make our decisions with our relationship with God, our vocation as husband and wife and parents first, and then third, our professions. But that doesn't mean that our professions don't matter or that God's not using them. It's just seeing everything connected and having rightly ordered priorities.
Have there been ways that you've seen the gifts that you've developed, say during your single years, like writing, bear fruit in your marriage and experience of motherhood?
This is one of the advantages to being an older mom is I had years to grow in my career and grow my reputation. And so now that I have children, I've been able to step back a little bit and have a little more flexibility than I would if I were 32 and really focused on, all right, I want to write a book. I want to do this. I'm like, I don't want to write any books right now. I'm good. Like, I just want to get the bills paid, do what God wants, and be with my kids. So there's freedom in that. I think that, like I said, my writing, God teaches me more through my writing than he teaches anybody else. And so anything anyone has ever learned or walked away from something I've written with, I've walked away with like 10 times more. And I do bring that to my motherhood. I bring that to my marriage. Everything God has ever asked me to write has helped me become more the woman I need to be. Still a long way to go, but I'm on that path. And so I think, and whatever your work is, you can see it that way. I mean, if you're a cabinet designer, if you are a nurse, if you're a doctor, like, that work should be teaching you something that, should obviously then translate to your marriage and family. Like, those lessons are meant to serve your relationship with Christ and your relationship with others, not just your professional development.
What else are you into at this moment?
Substack is really where I do most of my writing. So I have a weekly newsletter that goes out 3 weeks of the month when it's not summer. I answer questions about the faith and about motherhood. There is a dearth of women answering questions about the faith in the Catholic world. It's usually men who are explaining the faith. And I found that women sometimes need a woman's voice that sort of can understand where women are coming from with certain issues. And then I write a monthly essay that goes out to full subscribers. So that Substack is really where a lot of my attention goes, and Instagram and the babies. And I'm just working on another project right now for Word on Fire. So my husband being a teacher, summer is a busy time for me because we're both traveling because we can't travel during the school year. And then I'm trying to do more writing since he's home, and then things dial down again during the school year.
Is there anything that you would like to share that maybe we didn't cover?
I think for couples who are struggling with infertility and discerning adoption, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Like, adoption is not a cure for infertility. It doesn't allow you to conceive and bear babies, But infertility often is an invitation to adoption. Like when you have a desire to be a parent, to be a mother, and that is not happening, I think it's good to say, okay, I have this desire, and Lord, is this from you? Like, where is this coming from? And how do you want it to be fulfilled? Um, like you said, it's not just me that struggles with control and trust. We all tend to want to control the circumstances under which we think we want our desires fulfilled. We're like, I want this, and this is how I want it. And infertility really is an invitation to say, well, what do I want? Do I want to be pregnant? Do I want to be a mom? Like, do I want to love a child? Do I want to welcome a child into my home? And that was, for Chris and me, the defining question that led us to adoption was, what do we really want? Like, do we want to get pregnant, or do we want to be parents? And what we cared most about was being parents. Pregnancy would have been great, but that wasn't happening. So I would encourage couples to really look at that desire. And not everyone, you might have children already and feel the call to adoption on your heart. I don't think there can be enough good, faithful families for expectant mothers who are considering adoption to choose from. I do think adoption education is incredibly important. There is a lot of misinformation about adoption, or how the process works, or what adoption should look like. And so making sure you're educating yourself as you discern adoption.
Do you have an opinion on families who do have their own biological children to still consider adopting?
I do think that they should. Like, I think if you feel like there's a tug on your heart, that you should pursue that, because some moms really want their kids to have lots of siblings. Other moms want to entrust a child to a family that, is not able to conceive their own. It's like, again, it's always good for expectant moms to have lots of good choices. You can't have enough good families to choose from. A lot of times people will ask me if do I feel like I've missed out on, not being pregnant and not giving birth? And I don't at all. I've had a different experience of motherhood, but different isn't lesser. It's not bad. Like, I've carried my children in my heart. I have labored to bring them into our family. And now I'm just a mom. And so it's a different experience is not a lesser experience. I think that's a real fear of a lot of people before they adopt, that they're not going to love their kids as much. They're going to feel like they've missed out on something. And when you're doing God's will, you don't feel like you've missed out on anything. You feel like you've been given exactly what was the very best for you, for your children. God doesn't leave us feeling like we've missed out when we're following his will.
So you think that adoption should be more normalized when it comes to conversations about parenthood?
It's just a different route to parenthood. And there's different issues that come up with adoption. There's different things kids may struggle with. But if anyone has friends who've given birth to children and raised children past like 6 months, that parenthood is just fraught with issues. Children will struggle. Like, everyone works through their identity. Everybody, has to figure out who they are in the context of their family, in the context of the culture. Our culture is deeply disturbed in many ways right now, and that affects kids, whether they're, raised by their biological family or they're raised by adoptive families. You can't go into parenthood thinking you're going to get some perfect child just because you've conceived them. Like, it doesn't work that way. So there's issues with adoption, but there's issues with all forms of parenthood. And all of us are human and broken, and we all struggle. And so my job as a mother to my children is not to control them or make sure they're perfect. It's, to love them and support them and encourage them as they, follow the path God has for them.
Well, thank you, Emily, for being our guest on the PeakDay podcast. We wish you well in all of your endeavors, and many blessings on you and your young family.
All right. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.